Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Live Free, Ride Free. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times bestselling author of The Horse Boy and The Long Ride Home. Before I jump in with today's guest, I want to say a huge thank you to you, our audience, for helping to make this happen. I have a request. If you like what we do here, please give it a thumbs up, like, subscribe, tell a friend. It really, really helps us to make the progress. To find out about our certification courses, online video libraries, books, and other courses, please go to rupertisaacson.com. So now let's jump in. Welcome back to Live Free, Ride Free. I have had a question in my mind for about 3 decades now, which is, having lived in the USA for 25 years or so before I moved back to Europe, I was often intrigued in watching the rise of the conservative Christian thing and how that became increasingly politicized. And okay, I could understand that, but one of the things which I had trouble understanding was that if one valued creation, why did one not look after it? And where were the environmentalists within Christianity, at least within American Christianity? Because it just didn't seem to be there. And it seemed that this idea of man's dominion over the beasts or nature or whatever seemed to be taken as a carte blanche to bleep it all up, to mess it all up, to destroy it effectively. And that even that destroying it almost seemed to be an imperative within that theological outlook. Why couldn't that mean stewardship of God's creation? Why couldn't that mean environmentalism? Why was that philosophically or theologically opposed to the Christian conservative outlook and viewpoint? And I could never quite understand this. So I've been going around saying, where are the Christian environmentalists? Where are they? Where are they? Where are they? Where are they? I guess you have to ask a question enough times, because up pops Ben. So, ladies and gentlemen, sitting before you today is somebody who I think is part of a growing movement within Christianity in America, which is actually exactly this: the celebration of and nurture of nature, rather nature versus nurture, the nurture of nature within the Christian context. Fascinating. So, Ben, welcome on the show. Please tell us, and thank you for coming on, please tell us who you are, what you do, and why you do it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this and talk with you. So I am a professor of practical theology, which might lead you to ask, what is impractical theology? You know, which would be, in my mind, would be
Not
a good
all
bit of
theology
it.
impractical.
A good bit of it is, but theology that doesn't issue in love and care for others, to me, is impractical theology.
Okay.
Practical theology starts with the practices of Christians, the hospitality, forgiveness, these sorts of things, and tries to help individuals and congregations do it more faithfully. That's what practical theology is. So we partner with the social sciences and with the hard sciences to try to understand our world, to try to understand humans, how they respond. So instead of just having philosophy as a theological conversation partner, we have disability studies. And for me, I have sort of books on equines and these sorts of things. Or so it's a very broad conversation that's focused on practice. So that's my job. I also started a Center for Disability and Ministry at Western Theological Seminary.
And where's Western Theological Seminary based?
You would imagine it would be in the West, but I think it might have been at the time it was built before all the expansion happened with the U.S. But we're in Holland, Michigan.
Okay.
So right next to Lake Michigan. And so the center is the only theological school in the United States that offers accredited programs, graduate certificate, a master's of arts, and a doctor of ministry in disability and ministry.
Interesting.
And the focus is not so much on what we often hear when we think about church as a ministry, which is how are we going to minister to people with disabilities, often casting people with disabilities as needy, as not having particular theological insights, or problematizing them, seeing them more in terms of a medical model of disability, like how can we overcome these problems so they can be included in what we're doing. That's not what I'm doing at all. What I'm trying to do is gather insights from different body minds that are engaging in theology and engaging the Bible. Because if you have to live in a world as an expert life hacker and navigate a world that's not designed for you, you
Mm.
gain many, many insights. And so the purpose of the center is to amplify those insights, to invite people with disabilities into this conversation, to center their voices, to center their experiences in biblical interpretation, in theological investigation, and in the concrete practices of ministry.
Okay, that's a lot of words, and I'm going to ask you to explain some of them. But the first big question is, are you a priest?
Not a priest, I'm ordained in a more evangelical tradition.
Okay.
So my
But,
primary
but,
role is as professor,
but you are ordained.
but I am ordained.
Okay, so here's where I'd like to begin, and then I want to branch out into the work you're actually doing. Why in the USA is the idea of being an environmentalist counter or opposed to being Christian in the general context?
Right. So I do think it's based in poor interpretations of our scripture
Hmm.
and in a close relationship between a Western Enlightenment individualistic worldview and the way that Christianity in America came to be.
Okay, let's
So,
talk about how Christianity in America came to be.
yeah, so it's a frontier. The frontier movement, the individualism, the problem solving, all of that got mapped onto expressions of Christianity in the United States. And while on the one hand, you had a separation between church and state that was supposed to protect each from each other, allow religion to flourish and this sort of thing. So you can't, like, if you wanted to disestablish religion in the United States, where do you look? Since it's not legally established, you can't disestablish it. Instead, the way that it's been established is it's been more culturally established through values and blue laws. And if you're going to be a president, then you better say you're a Christian, these sorts of things. So politics, cultural values, all these sorts of things mix to create a kind of Christianity that sees that when it reads dominion in the Bible, thinks of dominion as dominance or control. And it's part of the larger Enlightenment project that begins with I think, therefore I am, of mastery, of control, of use, of othering. And it starts with dominating land, dominating the people who are on the land. And the Christians in the United States were, there were people on both sides, but the power was more complicit with that movement. And
Mm.
so then you have a misoriented notion of dominion that isn't all reflective of their own scriptures that talk about. There's a verse here and there, but you can do anything with a verse here or there. I mean,
Mhm.
I could make all kind of ridiculous claims that would then be called biblical because I can attach a verse to it. But the large arc of it is that it's supposed to be oriented by a different kind of relationship with creation. And stewardship is a better idea than dominance. Even the dominion that's supposed to be expressed is supposed to be one that leads to the flourishing of everything. And if everything's not flourishing, then nothing's flourishing.
Right. I mean, presumably, if one's, I also get that America started, at least Protestant America started with Pilgrim Fathers, but Pilgrim Fathers were actually religious extremists who were kicked out of England. They were actually in the Clink jail in London before they were put on the boat, the Mayflower, to be sent because they were troublesome. And we had just had a civil war in the UK where they'd cut the king's head off. No, so we were about to. We hadn't yet had it. And so these Puritan extremists who were reflecting, some of the extremism that led to these cataclysmic wars of religion that we had in Europe in the 17th century were like packed on boats and said, "All right, lads, off you go over there, and good luck to you." And of course, they made it, and people have heard of like the Salem witch trials, and people have heard of that sort of thing. But they, landed in New England and walked around being unpleasant and Puritan to everybody, including themselves, and sort of established that tradition a little bit. And we get that, but given that that's 400 years ago, and given that, okay, then you had other things going on, you had slavery, you had genocides of the Native Americans and so on, and manifest destiny, this idea in the 19th century of progress, commercial progress with Christianity getting mixed up. I do understand all that, but yeah, it didn't seem to that there were other parts of the world that were colonized where that kind of wholesale assault on the land and on nature didn't become the dominant culture. I'm thinking about my own family, for example, in South Africa, who were, I mean, were not dissimilar roots in many ways. There were, very Puritan Christians on the Dutch side who formed the Dutch Reformed Church, which is one of only two churches in the world that were formed specifically to justify, bad institutionalized racism, one of which being the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, the other one being, the Southern Baptist Church in the USA. But yet, those ancestors of mine in South Africa did take a stewardship line. And I guess they couldn't take a genocidal line. There was no slavery. There was colonized. There was no. They couldn't take a genocidal line, I think, because there were always more of the local people than there were of the white settlers. So you couldn't have done it if you tried. There just were not the millions and millions and millions of people coming into Africa that there were coming across the Atlantic. But then we look north at Canada, say, and we don't see Christianity being quite so mm, uh, uh, mm, what's the word, manipulated into something as a grand. It's not they didn't assault nature, but not perhaps to the same degree. They did do genocides, but they didn't have slavery. Then you look at Mexico and you go, well, they're pretty, it's pretty messed up down there. But you see it through a Catholic lens, and again, not not maybe this same sort of idea that to be Christian means paving the entire continent from sea to sea with a McDonald's every 200 meters. And if you do that, you're doing God's work. And that's sort of where it's ended up with a lot of Christians in America. And that still puzzles me, even though
Well,
I understand that historical process that you've outlined.
right. Well, there are a couple other theological biblical factors that shape this understanding as well. So one is this expansionism, the desire to manipulate, control, and create, moved by a vision that through progress, eventually the world's going to be so great through our technology progress, ingenuity, and faith that Jesus is just going to come down and join us. Right? That's one sort of end time sort of view, an eschatological view. But then other sorts of things happen as well. So the first one is this dominion, a misoriented dominion, which we've just talked about. Another theological sort of also enlightenment mindset that impacts the way Christianity is expressed in some pockets in the US is this drive to differentiate ourselves from other creatures, and not just differentiate ourselves, but say that we're superior somehow. So we're taking this whole chain of being thing, mapping it into Christian theology, and then saying that, and it makes sense because the Bible is a book about humans' perception of God. So it's a very
Mm.
anthropocentric book, right? But then, and so you go to these early Genesis accounts, and it seems like the whole world's there for you. And then you got to say, well, how am I different? Well, I'm created in the image of God. What does it mean that I'm created in the image of God and animals aren't? So we try to figure out what is this thing that makes us in the image of God and differentiate ourselves from the rest of creation to say that we're superior and we have the right to use them, use creation, animals and land to invest in this project that we think that we're called to do. And so there's another mindset. This drive to differentiate ourselves means that you can't look at a, now we're getting things from science now that are challenging how we choose to differentiate ourselves. We say, oh, well, we have rational minds and we can create tools. And then you find out that a crow can create a tool.
Hmm.
And then we have this kind of empathy, and then you learn more about pigs, and we have these parenting instincts, and you learn about pods of dolphins. And we're like, okay, every time we try to differentiate ourselves
Right. We have
on some
opposable
level,
thumbs, and then you look at a raccoon. Yeah.
right? And so, yeah, so then we start to say, well, I think a better idea is to think how animals, in relationship with animals, how it's not a kingdom where we're the kings in charge of everything, but it's a kinship relationship where we're related to everything. And perhaps the thing that makes us different is more about a responsibility we have than a capacity we have. Because if we start to think about the capacities, not only do we differentiate ourselves from animals, we differentiate ourselves from other humans. And then we value these humans less as well. So this was the thesis of a book called Beasts of Burden by Sunara Taylor, who growing up had followed these chicken trucks, these awful farmed chickens with feathers flying behind her, was trying to make sense of how is this, these farmed, the way that animals, this industrial farming, the implications for the environment, the implications for the chickens themselves, the implications for the workers. And she saw that her own disability, she can be cast as less than, because we do the same thing with the animals and we do the same thing with the land. So this drive to differentiate ourselves from creatures, what we've really done is disconnect ourselves from nature. And the biophilia hypothesis suggests that we were formed in who we are as humans alongside of nature.
What's
I
the
mean,
biophilia hypothesis? What is
this
that?
is by Edward Wilson, wrote that we have an innate connection or love for living things or for
How can we
nature.
not? I mean, we're part of it, right?
And that's what he says. Like this whole network of conversation going between trees and mushrooms also has connections with our bodies. We've
Mm,
just lost touch with it. And
right.
we've tried to separate ourselves from it, control it, dominate it. And in the process, we've disconnected ourselves from our own lives. So this drive to differentiate didn't just differentiate us from animals, it differentiated us from ourselves, from each other, from the land, from creation, and didn't actually answer the question of what makes us different from
Mm.
animals. So maybe we should talk more about what makes us the same. So that's
Well,
a second theological move that
okay.
that's feeding this in the United States. And there's one more. You want to hear
Okay.
that or ask a
Well,
question?
just quickly,
Yeah.
is there is there a movement within Christianity about why are we the same as animals?
Oh yeah, there is.
I've
There's
never
a
heard of it.
wonderful book. There's a book by David Clough, Clough, David Clough, who's now at
Like
Aberdeen,
Clough, Clough. Okay, David
Yep.
Clough, right?
And he wrote a book called Creaturely Theology, which starts with any theology you
Shit.
do. It needs to start with your commonality with the rest of the world as a creature.
This almost sounds like Celtic Christianity, Druidic Christianity, or so.
Well,
Interesting.
yeah, you could say that that kind of Christianity is very different from Roman Christianity because of the conversation partners.
Mm, mm, mm.
Right. And so that's
How
another
interesting.
problem with Christianity is people want to think that their expression is the final expression and then sort of use that colonizing mindset.
Right.
And so evangelism becomes you become like me, whereas it should be an expansion of our understanding of that which we all share. So every cultural boundary you cross brings new riches and insights into this Christianity that we claim to share. So
Would you classify yourself as an evangelist?
if I get to define what it is,
Okay. Okay.
because my experience with evangelists is it's techniques that were used to manipulate people into saying certain magic words that means they're in instead of out.
Right.
And I don't think that has anything to do with what the historical figure of Jesus was doing or the early church was doing. That was more a proclamation about what it means to live in this world in a different kind of a way. That's challenging power, that's caring for the poor, that is caring for the sick, that is involved in harmony, flourishing, and life. So then my evangelism in that sense is a doing, a being, and a saying. It's the way that I serve the world. When did I see you and when did I visit you in prison? And when did I give you clothes? And when did I give you food? Was the question that was asked in this sheep and the goats parable of Jesus, right? He said, whenever you did it to the least of these, you did it unto me. And so this kind of service is one way that I evangelize. So there's a doing, there's a being. What kind of communities am I creating, and how do they include the gifts of other people that are marginalized in other settings? That's a kind of community. So there's a being of evangelism, and then there's a saying. Sometimes you give explanation verbally to what's going on, but that's usually the last resort for me, for my
But you and I
experience of
both know
evangelism.
that that's not, that's, it sounds wonderful, but you and I both know that's not how evangelism is usually presents itself, right?
Exactly. And fortunately, I'm
You're
teaching
gonna
a
go to
course.
hell unless you abide by
Yeah.
these rules, and this big bloke up there with a beard's gonna give you a spank bottom and send you to the place where the chaps with the pointy heads will stick you with pointy things.
So
And
let's tie that understanding of evangelism to the third movement.
okay.
So we have this dominion issue where we've gotten dominion wrong. We have
Mm.
the drive to differentiate ourselves from animals and creation, where we actually separate ourselves from ourselves and
You
from
just
our
said we've
world and from
gotten
others.
Dominion wrong. That really excites me, and I want to
Yeah.
return to that later. Okay.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
Um,
interrupt you.
So there's dominion, drive to differentiate. The last one fits right into that kind of evangelism. What happens in that kind of evangelism? We save your soul from a world that's going to burn. I collect bumper stickers just for fun about that kind of evangelism. And it's like when the last trumpet sounds, I'm out of here. And it's like flames coming up. And it's like, if you think you're right, you better be right, or smoking or non-smoking, like eternity, smoking or non-smoking. People think they're so clever with these bumper stickers, but all they're doing really is offending people. I can't imagine anyone who's ever had their mind changed by a bumper sticker. So what is that viewpoint? Well, it's this, that that creation and animals are just a dramatic backdrop, and even our bodies are a dramatic backdrop to a transaction that goes on between our soul and God. And it's a really escapist kind of understanding. So now you have another theological demotivation to be invested in this world, because this world's temporary. This
Oh,
world's
I
going to be
see.
destroyed. And so let's save souls. So they have soul winners Bibles, and people are seeing how many souls they can save. Well, what in the world's a soul aside from, like, dig down into me? Where is it? Like, so spirit. My point is that if you want to find the most spiritual thing, really get to know another person, because God is in there. If
Yeah,
so, theologically speaking, if God wants to demonstrate love, then God takes on human flesh and has to live in under the contingency that we live in. And what does he do? He crosses boundaries. He goes to where lepers are. He invites the tax collector nobody likes. He hangs around with women and gives them credibility to their testimony. All these sorts of things. So you have
all good ways to get yourself crucified, basically. Yeah.
exactly, especially when your followers start saying you're Lord in a world where the Roman imperial coins make that very claim about their rulers.
Yes. What's interesting with that? Okay, so that there's just a bunch of things there. One is that one of the, as you know, people who interpret Old Testament stuff like Book of Revelation and the Rapture and all of that, which is very much the sort of American punishment based, idea of Christianity, and talk about sort of Christ and Antichrist. And I've often thought that in the Book of Revelation, where it says the Antichrist is going to come along, I was like, well, is that one person or is that sort of a collective? And it seems that there's an awful lot of talk by people who espouse themselves to be Christians, talking about highly unchristian things like my right to have automatic weapons or my right to be just a dick to people or to be hostile in whatever way. That's anti-Christ, that's anti-ethical to Christ, that's anti-Christ, that's anti-Christ. And so I've often thought, oh, I see, the antichrist is this espousing of anti-Christian beliefs under the banner of Christ. Okay, that makes
Yeah.
sense. And now, of course, this is not the first generation in which that's happened. That's been going on, ever since Christianity became look at the Spanish Inquisition. But nonetheless, we sort of ought to be past that now. And perhaps so it's exciting to me when you say that within the evangelical, which I have experienced as punishment based, basically join our club or you'll go to hell, and saving souls or getting souls. The only other person I ever know who seems to go out to get souls seems to be Satan. They was talking about the devil went down to Georgia. He was looking for a soul to steal. He was in a bank. He was way behind. He was willing to make a deal. He seemed quite
Nice.
motivated to get souls, right? Presumably, God can look after souls. And here's full disclosure. I'm a full-on card carrying for listeners too. I'm a full-on card carrying believer in God. I believe in God. I so believe in God. I cannot tell you who God is or what God is. I wouldn't presume to be able to do that. But somewhere within me, there's never been any question. But God is not somebody who creates people in order to cast them into a fiery pit, because that
Right.
would be God as a sort of petulant 12-year-old.
Well, if
Um,
you do that, look how much control that gives you if you do it. I mean,
mm,
that all fits into this same thing of mastery, domination, and control. So they've
right.
taken a worldview and created something, they've taken this category of Christian and filled it with something that allows them to
Mm,
have power and domination and control, to project, to
absolutely. Absolutely. And
explain.
it just becomes Pharisees and a priesthood and all of that.
Exactly.
I get it,
So
and
it's a
how it works.
malformation. And I think many Christians then are malformed into this expression of Christianity that is really incongruent with the Christ that they claim in their
Right.
title, their name.
And I don't know if I'm Christian. I don't know if I'm not Christian.
Yeah.
I hang out at the Bushman trance fires. My experiences of God are as much within watching a healer in the Kalahari use leopard energy to pull a sickness out of somebody as it is to do something within our culture. And at the same time, I absolutely think that at the mystic center of all religions is the sort of same expression of God. And you find that kind of nature-based shamanism within certain types of Christianity. You might find it in sort of Catholic shamanic overlaid things down in Central South America. You might find it in Francis of Assisi. You might find it
Right,
in
right.
the Celtic Christian outlook and so on.
So the
Um,
kind of Christianity then that you're allergic to is the kind that asks you to be a cultural apprentice. It's you have to become a cultural apprentice,
it's
in
the
other words.
kind that wants to sell off Yellowstone.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's what I'm allergic to,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That
because that
wants
seems to
to
me anti creation.
it wants to take indigenous people's holy spaces and name them after prominent American folks, right?
Right. Well, every church in Europe is built on a pagan site, but
Yeah.
yeah, no, exactly. The desecration of nature, the
So you
destruction.
don't have, so they don't have a theological paradigm for engaging it. So that's what's happened in a sense is those original moves of the Christian movement sort of stop. So I mean, originally it was a Jewish sect, and
Right,
then it becomes Greek. And when it becomes Greek, it gets the treasure of Greek philosophical understanding, but then
which
it
is
creates
Egyptian. Yes, yeah,
doctrines,
yeah.
right, that then are exclusive of other people. And then along with Constantine power, you have the ability not
Seems
just
to have
to.
foiled his wife, by the way.
But no, this it's I'm not he's not a wonderful figure, right? The reason there's a Julian the Apostate is because who came after Constantine, who didn't like Christianity at all, and put his face on the coin with a big philosopher's beard to give the Christians the finger and put astrological signs on the back and said Rome needs to go back to the what we were, is because Constantine had killed every potential person who could challenge him as a Christian emperor. But what you have then is you have power and Christianity together.
Yeah.
And in order to keep a peaceable kingdom, here's the doctrine that we're going to agree on. So there aren't these
Sure.
factions.
Nicene Christianity, Catholic
Right.
Orthodox.
And here we go to our problem with creation. Nicene Christianity is responding to the question of the salvation of humans, not the broader biblical narrative about the restoration of the world. That all of creation is groaning to be redeemed, that according to their own scripture, Christ took on flesh, not just humanity, but took on all flesh and redeems it all, that all things come together in Christ. So that is supposed to be the Christian message, but Nicene Christianity is all about the salvation of individuals. We're going to have fights over an iota, homoousian, homoousian. People get excommunicated. Now you have power. You could actually kill them if they have a different view.
Right.
And so so we have that in the U.S., that it's of benefit to be a Christian, that it gives you a certain kind of power. And the theological questions that were asked in the acception of Christianity are about the salvation of the human and not about the restoration and redemption of all of creation. And we just really haven't developed much since then, but there have always been people who speak against that. You mentioned Francis of Assisi, but even contemporarily, there was Pope Francis, who just passed away, wrote a beautiful piece on creation and theology. There's a book by Victoria Loors called Church of the Wild. That's about wild Christianity. There's Thomas Berry, a Catholic. He called himself a biologian. So
Love that.
yeah.
But where are these people? Why don't we hear about them? Why are you the first person telling us about it?
Well, I'm the first person telling you,
Yeah, but come on. I mean,
yeah, it's not a center movement, is what
no.
it's a peripheral movement. And
Why isn't it? Or is it going to become one?
well, in part, it's a giving up of power, and nobody likes to give up power. It's a
Mm.
distribution of power. It's an equaling of people. It's costly. It requires thinking about what you eat. It requires, it's just not the American way. It's not about gaining things and possessing things and controlling things. It's about giving that sort of a worldview up and committing to a kind of flourishing that might mean, in order for mutual
Sure,
flourishing, you
you are
might have to
sounding quite
give up some
un-American by
things.
this point. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, we'll see. And to many, I'll sound unchristian, but that
yeah,
doesn't hurt my feelings either.
yeah. Okay, so you've convinced me that there is a movement. What's your work with this movement to bring us to an idea of stewardship rather than effing it all up?
Yeah.
And
And I would even say stewardship's a limited term because it suggests
go
that we
ahead.
have the knowledge and wisdom to do. I mean, have we done more good or more harm for the earth than even than the stewardship things we've tried to do? I don't know, right?
Yeah.
To some degree, stewardships is an arrogant position that doesn't recognize our limited knowledge base and doesn't
Well,
draw
there's
upon
now
the
some
knowledge of.
arrogance as a human, right?
Right, right. Yeah, and again, here go back to scripture in Job. One of the amazing verses when Job is trying to make sense of what's going on with his life is God's response: ask the beasts and they'll tell you. Ask the birds of the air and they'll tell you. And
Mm.
we've broken this conversation. We're only talking to ourselves, says Thomas Berry, this Catholic biologian. He says
Bio.
we're not listening to the rivers, we're not listening to the animals, to the plants. We're only talking to ourselves. We have a we've lost the wisdom of the land.
Where's Thomas Barry based?
Oh, I don't know. You can find I think he's passed away recently. The Sacred Universe,
The
and
Sacred
Evening
Universe.
That's one of his
Was
brilliant
he
books.
American? Was he British? Where's he from?
I think he's a U.S.
And is
Catholic
he Barry with an
priest.
I-E or a Y?
Berry.
Thomas Barry, The Sacred Universe, Biologian. Got it. Okay, got to check it out. Sounds like I
Yeah.
won't be able to have him on the show. You're going to have to interpret him for me.
Well,
Okay.
so this is that's a where people are talking about it though. Matthew Scully wrote a book on dominion where he's challenging this whole notion of dominion. It's called
Matthew Scully.
Scully.
Okay.
Matthew Scully, Dominion.
Dominion. Okay.
And one of the things he says right at the start of the book is this. He says, when you look at a rabbit and you can see only a pest or vermin or a meal or a commodity or a laboratory subject, you aren't seeing the rabbit anymore. You're seeing only yourself and the schemes and appetites you bring to the world.
Wow.
And that's what dominion is. It's the schemes and appetites we bring to the world. We've broken the conversation. We like the idea of kingdom, and we like to think we take on the kingly role, and then we're no longer kin. We're not in a kinship relationship with all of creation. So, how do I bridge the gap between my inherited Christianity and the vision that I want to point people towards? A
Right.
couple of ways.
Okay.
One is Christian, indigenous Americans and indigenous American Christians who have a whole different paradigm when they read scriptures and when they come to faith that critiques the one that they've inherited. In other words, through their scripture and their reading now, they have an independent standard by which they can critique the colonizers' Christianity. And how do they critique it? Well, they critique it as people who live on Turtle Island, whose mythology is filled with animals in wise roles. They critique it as people who, when they read the Bible, it's a worldview that makes more sense to them than a modern Enlightenment worldview, where there are spirits and angels and energies and animals who are deeply involved in the telling of these stories and in the redemption. So, one gentleman in particular, Randy Woodley, he
Randy
interviewed
Woodley.
Woodley, Woodley, Randy
Hmm.
Woodley.
Hmm.
And I don't remember his tribe, but he talked to many different tribes and he found something they all have in common. He called the harmony way. He calls it the harmony way, and it's a way of being in the world that's not so competitive, that sees the wisdom of animals, that doesn't try to manipulate and control. And it's just such a different sort of kinship worldview to the modern Enlightenment worldview that's informed American Christianity, that I would say it's almost a different Christianity that's more faithful to the biblical vision of shalom, peace, harmony, well-being, this sort of thing. So conversation partners like Randy Woodley, I'm looking up right here at my shelf if I can find my glasses. I have like three different pairs of glasses, depending on how far away something is. We have Becoming Kin by Patty Krawick. We have Restoring the Kinship View by Four Arrows and another author. So these indigenous worldviews, these ways of understanding how are we supposed to be in the world, then is informs their Christian expression, right? And that's the same move that happened when Christianity became it went from a Jewish sect to include Greek people, and then the treasures of Greek philosophy come in and have problems, but also things. And then it goes to the Germanic people, and then it goes to when Christianity goes to Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, you have a critique of colonizing Christianity by African indigenous churches that didn't want to give up an African worldview that doesn't start with the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, but starts more with like an Ubuntu, which is we are, therefore I am. So it's a more communal understanding of self than an individualistic one. And
Okay.
right?
Now, something I go to with that is, again, because my family's Southern African, because a lot of these cultures that you've include, and also I'm half Jewish. So Jewish culture, a lot of Southern African culture, you're still talking about agricultural, post-agricultural, and herding cultures that are effectively warrior cultures with the same hierarchical systems and endless cycles of blood feud, warfare, atrocity, four horsemen of the apocalypse up, and being very happy to colonize each other when they're not the ones being colonized. You know, the Zulus, the Umfukani, the Difakani, which was you know, the Zulus in South Africa colonizing everybody else around them until they ran up against the Boers and the British, who then colonized them. You know, West Africa, lots of colonization going on there, you know, within that subcontinent. The Germanic tribes colonizing within Europe before they went on, blah, blah, blah. The Romans, obviously. And then, you know, Second Temple Judaism, by no means a nature-based thing. You know, by then, you know, Judaism having gone from, you know, way back pre-Bronze Age, a polytheistic thing, to eventually, you know, Yahweh and his wife, to Yahweh, to some semblance of what we now know, to, you know, a sect that becomes Christian much later on. But by the time that happens, of course, you know, they're empire building, colonizing people. They just happen to run up against the Romans, you know, who were just better at it, you know, for whatever reason. So we're all the same dysfunctional, nation destroying people, except for the non-warrior tribes, the non-warrior peoples, the hunter-gatherers. And yeah, we seem to have this at the beginning of the Bible, don't we, with Cain and Abel. You know, Cain is the farmer, kills his brother Abel, who seems to be with the beasts of the field, the hunter-gatherer. Classic thing, you know, the farmers can't tolerate free-moving people going across the land. They can't tolerate free-moving animals going across the land. So we end up with a parable, it seems, a metaphor within story, you know, Cain and Abel, blah, blah, blah. And then the mark of Cain, the curse of Cain, being that he wanders forever. Well, of course, what do farmers have to do? They exhaust the land, or they have lots and lots of kids, because you need lots and lots of kids to put the crop in the soil and bring the crop out. So you can only pass the land on to the oldest son. So everyone else has to go out and colonize somewhere else and mess everyone else's lives up. You know, this is the curse, blah, blah, blah. It keeps going. We know this. And yes, of course, evangelical American Christianity is one of the many expressions of this, but so are some of the expressions of Christianity in Africa, or, you know, other parts of the world. And I've never seen like the problem with the idea of, say, evolution and God. Is like, well, why wouldn't an intelligent God just design something as amazing as, you know, as evolution? I mean, I don't see that as being in any way contradictory. You know, Darwin himself was a Christian, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But what do we do with it all? The most functional people I've ever met on the planet were Sun Bushmen, non-Christians, who many Christians I know would say are damned, who yet live a very Christ-like existence, both in terms of how they relate to each other, how they relate to outsiders, and how they relate to the planet. Given that Christianity comes out of Second Temple Judaism, which is by no means an environmental movement, how do we go back to Abel? How do we sort of leapfrog back over Cain and go back to Abel and keep our Christ thing? I think I could answer that question, but I kind of want to hear it from you. This is intriguing to me. And it's also intriguing to me that this environmental movement, by the way, within Christianity, I've not heard it out of the UK. I've not heard it out of Africa either. So it seems to be very fitting that it comes out of the USA, who are the people with the Christians who kind of messing it up the most. Well, America, land of extremes. Okay, you're going to find people like you.
Yeah.
As you know, if you followed any of my work, I'm an autism dad, and we have a whole career before this podcast in helping people with neurodivergence, either who are professionals in the field. Are you a therapist? Are you a caregiver? Are you a parent? Or are you somebody with neurodivergence? When my son Rowan was diagnosed with autism in 2004, I really didn't know what to do. So I reached out for mentorship, and I found it through an amazing adult autistic woman who's very famous, Dr. Temple Grandin. And she told me what to do. And it's been working so amazingly for the last 20 years that not only is my son basically independent, but we've helped countless thousands of others reach the same goal, working in schools, working at home, working in therapy settings. If you would like to learn this cutting edge neuroscience-backed approach, it's called Movement Method. You can learn it online. You can learn it very, very simply. It's almost laughably simple. The important thing is to begin. Let yourself be mentored as I was by Dr. Grandin and see what results can follow. Go to this website, newtrailslearning.com. Sign up as a gold member. Take the online Movement Method course. It's in 40 countries. Let us know how it goes for you. We really want to know. We really want to help people like me, people like you out there live their best life, to live free, ride free, see what happens. Can you explain to me then? No, can you fantasize to me? Go ahead 20 years, 100 years in your mind. What's coming out of Christian America, and how do we turn it all around for the benefit of our planet and ourselves?
Yeah. I think it starts a couple of ways. Deb Reenstra, there's another name for you, wrote a book called Refugeia, and she talks about a Refugeia Faith. But the way the book starts is when Mount St. Helens exploded, everything's covered with ash, everything looks like death. But under the logs, and under the rocks, there's life. And these are spaces of refugia, and it's grown back vibrant and lush. And she says we need to have the same kind of thing in our Christianity, in a sense, and a Christianity that is exactly as you explained it. There are these pockets of refugia. So I think if we set up these pockets,
refugia, I love it. Okay,
refugia, yeah, you'd love to talk with Deb and Ron Reenstra. Actually, they'd be wonderful guests for you.
Okay.
So it's a place of growth. It's a place of of regrounding, of moving forward, of life among what seems like death. And so then in my mind, I'm trying to create places of refugia within the church. And so this goes to one project I'm on right now.
Okay.
And I think the place to start is with the children. Malaguzzi wrote that children have 100 languages and we take away 99 of them. In other words, children communicate so many ways. Everything's a language, everything's a world. They're filled with wonder, in part because they're not captive to their rational capacities and trying to name, explain, control. They know they don't know things. And as a result, they go into spaces with a kind of curiosity, and they find a sense of connection, a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, and also a sense of lament and humility. This is the place to start, right? So if we can start in the church with our children, connecting them to nature as a theological conversation partner that's really not been listened to the same way since the printing press, I would say, particularly in the US. It's like this movement to give everybody a Bible, everybody 7 or 8 Bibles. This is something that you don't want to, if I say this in a church or I say it at a seminary, I'm really going to get pushed back against. But why are we creating more Bibles? Right? In a sense, what's that doing to the environment? Because we're so word centered that now the Bible, instead of something that
the word, and the word was God, logos.
Yeah. So, the Bible didn't even come into being so people could have it for most of Christianity. Right. You were a church that had maybe one letter from Paul or Luke Acts, and another church had more. And when you met together, it'd be read. But the most important thing was your way of life in the world. What's your way of life in the world? But post-printing press, Match that with Cartesian individualism and our tendency towards mastery and control. Now everybody has their own Bible. Everybody's their own pope. Everybody's their own church to some degree. But this movement, then what becomes squelched is God's voice in nature. And the way we've organized our societies make us less and less connected to this world. You know, we have conditioned environments, and even within the churches, then you try to replicate things, a vault that goes to the heavens. Well, just step outside and look up, right? I was at I was at a camp once, and they took everybody from the camp inside a room and started saying, now imagine, you know, Jesus is there and Peter's walking on the water. Imagine a lake. I'm like, we were just outside, there was a lake, you know, go out to the lake. Why do we feel like we can't gain this wisdom? It's because it's about control. These wrong interpretations are dangerous. But you know, anyways, the point being,
Well, yeah, if I
let's
want you
start
to
with
pay me
children.
tithes, if I want you to pay me money, then
Yeah.
I've got to, yeah, get you in a room and brainwash you. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So let's start with the children and let's teach the adults a new language through the eyes of children. So you learn that. Let's start with the assumption that children are theological creatures, that children have a connection to God, that God loves children, and that God's communicating to them in a way that they understand. Well,
Mm,
that makes the Bible secondary.
true.
You know,
It
it
does.
doesn't mean that the Bible's unimportant, but for children, it makes it secondary. What's the most important thing is the encounter they have with the divine through creation. So let's learn the many languages of children and of children with disabilities. So we actually got a grant from the Lilly Foundation to do this. And the first thing we did is 3 orientations for all the adults around disability theory, disability theology, theology of children, children as spiritual beings, children as learning, children as curious, a theology of wonder, these sorts of things, and a theology of nature and creatures. And so we prepared them, and then we had 6 weeks where for 4 hours on a Sunday, we just followed the children. We followed them to see birds and put their arms out and see what kind of bird they are, and to hold snakes. Now, this is not snake handling. I want to be clear. That's not the kind of Christianity I'm in. But just to enjoy and appreciate creation, to play in the words, to create environments, to what's going to change the church is not a doctrine about how we should treat creatures. What's going to change the church is a generation of people who are in love with the world that God created and see it as enchanted, that expect to encounter God when they're next to a horse, expect to encounter God in the beautiful music of a stream. The holiest place I have is the pond behind my house, where I have Wendy the willow tree dancing, watching me as I'm inside the pond pulling out the algae, surrounded by a halo of fish who snap up everything I loosen, where ducks come along the side and watch what I'm doing curiously, and let the red-winged blackbird know I'm not coming for their nest, so you don't have to dive bomb his head. He's okay. You know, and the Oculus I have isn't in a dark room, a little hole that says God's present. It's the whole sky, you know, and the baptismal waters I have aren't confined to a fount, but it's my whole pond. And I share these baptismal waters with the fish. So why would I want to put chemicals in that's going to hurt them if I could find a better way to coexist? Because these fish helped me make it through COVID as I went and fed them. So
This
anyway,
sounds like
that's,
heresy.
oh, absolutely. I'm good with,
Have the Inquisition shown up at your house yet?
no, I'm sure they'll come though. And what better way to go than trying to enlarge the faith.
Well, so in terms of pushback, I love what you just said. In terms of pushback, what pushback do you get on w- working with your Center for Disability in Ministry and looking at the wonder with which children engage in nature or nature and special needs, you know, your Lily Grant, it would seem insane to push back against that. So I'm interested to know what sort of insanities have arisen.
Well, you'll be. interested to know, I've received almost no pushback.
Okay. That's just because you
People,
haven't publicized it yet.
perhaps
Yeah.
we'll see how that goes. I mean, yeah, I'm working on a book on harmony with horses, where I'm promoting these sort of theological worldviews. And, I mean, I'm a published author. You are too. Once you put something out there, you know, people are going to hate it. People are going to think you're the worst thing ever. For me, I wrote a book called Disabling Mission, Enabling Witness. And the whole idea of that mission, the way that we practice mission or evangelism, has been informed by very ableist biases,
Hmm, good point.
certain kinds of communication, right? So I say to disable in my mind is to take away those ableist biases. And so that's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to, my theological project
It's about
is,
disarming, really. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, disabling theological education.
Mm,
That's how the Center for Disability and Ministry came to be.
mm.
And then I wrote, you know, disabling mission. And I'm always thinking about that. How can we center wisdom that hasn't been at the center? So how do you center children? You center children's insights, then you engage theology differently. You center your relationship with the horse, then you see the world differently.
Right.
So the
Okay.
main pushback I get would be that I'm what would be called a pantheist or a panentheist, I wouldn't say I'm a pantheist, which means everything is God, God is everything. That wouldn't be where I fit in. Panentheism says God is in everything. I don't have a problem with that. I just don't like the label. But traditional theism has been so informed by, I think, sort of Greek philosophical categories that they've been so entwined. It's almost like it's the same thing. So I'm happy to push back against various things and do some constructive theology and see what happens. And unless you're willing to make some mistakes, it, you gotta go ahead and make some statements to stimulate discourse.
True. Okay. So, what are the odds that we will see in the next 20 years conservative Christian mega churches in Houston going out and planting forests?
I'm hopeful.
Talk to me about that hope. Take me through how that could happen.
Yeah.
Because I would love that to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I think as consequences of the way that we've treated the environment hit home. And so a lot of the immigration migration is related to climate issues, right? A lot of people's homes and places that they value have been impacted by this. A lot of the things they like to eat have been impacted by this. Once it becomes a personal experience for you, then for many Christians, that's when you start to ask new and fresh theological questions. And my hope is by the time they're asking these questions, which I can't imagine would happen, particularly, not to get political, but in this administration, you're going to roll back any sort of environmental restraint.
Yeah.
As we see the consequences of this, then even these more conservative congregations will have to start asking new theological questions. And my hope is that there's a group of resources there that they can call upon as this theological movement, eco-theology, and biologians and people who are creating refugia places, as they're growing, these resources will become, someone from within their tradition is going to write something that they're interested in.
I love it. I guess what I'm seeing practically is, yeah, let's say the children of the people growing up within that type of church historically have had two choices. They could either reject and say it's all a load of wank because it kind of is, and then go off into their lives outside the church or certainly outside that church,
Yep.
but still hopefully take some nice things with them if they could salvage some. But it's usually been stay or go. It's usually been drink the Kool-Aid or escape.
And when they
But
escape, they go a couple ways. There's
yeah,
something called ex-evangelicals. I don't know if you've ever heard that.
died again Christians. Yeah.
Yeah. So instead of evangelical, they're ex-evangelicals. They're not giving up the faith. They're just giving up that particular way of understanding it. And these
Mm.
ex-evangelicals are much more connected to issues around sexuality, around
But
dominance
again,
and
where are these
power,
people? I don't hear about them.
women's
I don't meet
roles.
them. These evangelicals. Where are they?
They're out there. They're very much into podcasting. So
Okay.
you could you could easily type in ex-evangelical and you'll
Okay.
find a lot of them. That's sort of the white upper middle class way to deal with your issues in the United States. Just start a podcast.
Well, look at me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, me too. We have a podcast through the center called Disabling the Church. So,
Okay. Disabling
yeah,
the church. Okay. I need to start listening to it.
yeah. So that's one direction they go. The other direction is, yeah, maybe they give up on calling themselves Christians. But Pew, if you look at these Pew Research sort of interviews about the state of religion in the United States, you find that even people who say that they are the nuns, meaning when you check something about your religious affiliation, you check the category nun, you keep going down the list, you find out that they aren't giving up on God. And one of the places they feel most connected to God is in
Nature.
nature.
Yeah.
And so that's the path that I'm taking to get this conversation going. I don't think I'm going to change the mind of the dyed-in-the-wool American evangelical of the more conservative ilk. I think I can work with ex-evangelicals very well, and I can work with people who have left the church but still find God when they walk in Saugatuck Dunes, these sorts of things. And I can give them some language, and I can say, look, this scripture is actually pointing to this kind of thing that you're talking about. The Christian faith is actually, it should have the capacity to speak into this in meaningful
Well,
ways.
that was going to be my next question, actually, was, I don't know scripture like you know scripture. I know little fragments here and there. Can you give me some choice quotes from Old and New Testament about why we shouldn't be buggering it all up?
Yeah, I mean, one was that from Job 12:7, ask the beasts and they will teach you. Ask the birds of the air and they'll show you. This whole idea that there's wisdom in creation and we should connect with the wisdom. You go to some of the Psalms, and so the problem, okay, so we're oriented in scripture by the creation accounts in Genesis, the beginning of Genesis, which seems to make the point that everything's made, then you make humans, now it's very good, and your job is to have dominion over it, right? But then you read in the creation in the Psalms where it talks about the creation, and it says the hills are made for the coonie, and the deep is made for the beasts of the sea, almost like humans aren't even in mind for this. The idea that animals have a connection with God without us. And if you want to know anything about that, you better hope they're around to tell you. So you want to preserve their environment and you want to learn you want to learn about them. You want to draw on the sciences. So as I think about horses, because you had my wife, Melissa, I think on a different
Yeah,
podcast,
the
and
Equine Assisted World podcast. Yeah.
and so she runs Renew Therapeutic Riding Center. And one of the things we're working on is how do Christians think about horses as having a vocation, a
Oh, boy.
calling? Yeah, yeah. So
Okay.
vocation. So vocation is right to
It's
vocare,
a podcast in
call.
itself. Yeah.
Yeah, so in Christianity, the view is you've been called to follow. And when we think of vocation, we think of the big noun. What's the thing I'm going to do when I grow up? So we're anxious all the way through high school. What are we going to be? And then we don't know who we are after retirement because we don't know anymore who we are now because we don't have the job. But Kathleen Cahalan says instead of talking about vocation as a noun, we should talk about it in terms of prepositions. I'm called alongside, I'm called through, I'm called into, I'm called out of. We have
Mm.
many different callings. So I'm called as a professor. I'm called as a grant writer. I'm called as a husband. I'm called as a father. I'm also called into relationship with my dogs. I'm called into relationship with Silk the horse. And we started thinking, wouldn't people think differently of animals if instead of saying this is a tool that you use for services, that you thought of as an animal as having a vocation, a calling from God? Well, vocation is also about being able to use your voice and vocation. I've amplified my voice in different settings. How
Both
does
of
a
them.
horse have
Right.
a voice? How does a horse have agency? Well, in order to understand this, we need to learn how to communicate with a horse. So we have to draw on Stephen Peters and Martin Black and all the people who've done this horse head, human head. I forget who wrote that. Jane something.
Horse brain, human brain. Yeah, yeah,
Horse
yeah.
brain, human
Yeah,
brain.
yeah.
Yeah. But so now you're learning, you're looking at the horse differently. You're saying this horse needs to have a voice. I need to learn how to listen to the voice of the horse. If the horse isn't flourishing, the horse isn't in a vocation. So we can't do anything that's of benefit to a student that's not in line with the vocation or calling of the horse. So there's mutual flourishing. How do we organize our center? How do we feed horses? How do we turn them out? How do we determine pastures? How do we allow them the time to get used to an environment before they go in it? How do we, do we know that the horse, if this chair's in a different place, it's not a chair, it might be a lion now. All those weird things about horses that Melissa could tell you all about. But horses have a vocation, they have a voice. We just have to learn how to hear their voice because it's usually a nonverbal voice. It's ear posture. It's the tension of the muzzle. It's the what the
Right.
hind end is doing. It's what the tail's doing. It's what the how the eyes are. Are the eyes soft? Or are the eyes dead? Yes, the horse is doing the thing, but the horse is getting no enjoyment. Yeah, all these sorts of things are for the vocation of the horse. Now this is it's a creature that we invite to share a vocation with us, but the horse can say no. And we have to listen to the horse to know when the horse is saying no. I have a different vocation. So swing, because of trauma related to being a polo horse, is never going to be a good therapeutic riding horse because of all the, unless you desensitize swing and take all the joy out of his life and make him an automan that just walks around the arena loping around carrying somebody. That's not swing's vocation. But swing is very good at being a pasture friend to another horse.
If we then go from horses to mountains, rivers, ecosystems,
Right.
talk to me about mountains, rivers, and ecosystems having vocations.
So mountains have been around a lot longer than we have. I don't think we have the patience to listen to a mountain or the lifespan to listen to a mountain. Our listening is this big. Mountains listening is generations and generations and generations. But I do believe that mountains have vocations other than being blown up with dynamite to hold images of presidents or images of Civil War heroes or anything like that.
Or a coal mine. Yeah.
Right. And I think the people who were closer to the vocation of these mountains were the indigenous people whose livelihood were tied to the mountains, whose mythologies were connected to the mountains. I think bodies of water have a lot to say to us, but we're putting chemicals in their throats. We're putting runoff from fertilizers in their throats. We're putting plastic in their throats. We're taking all the life of the ecosystems out of their throats. And we're starting to hear their voice again when we participate in helping reefs to grow back. And when we have responsible ways of fishing instead of just huge nets that pull up everything, or sharks that are just harvested for their fins, or whales that are just harvested
Yeah,
for
when
their.
we just stop behaving abusively, basically.
Yeah, so here's the thing. This goes to vocation. The vocation of a horse is to be a horse. That's it. And a horse doesn't mess up its vocation, but humans can mess up the horse's vocation. And the vocation of a mountain is to be a mountain. And mountains don't mess up their vocation, but humans can get in the way of their vocation.
What's a
When
human's vocation then?
this is the
And we mess
key.
that up.
Yes, a human's vocation is to be a human, but we suck at it. We want to dominate and control other humans.
What
We
is
want
being
to
a human?
dominate.
What is being a human?
So now you're into something from a Christian standpoint that's called theological anthropology. So
Great.
anthropology is just the study of humans and human cultures and humans in the world. Theological anthropology adds another layer. What does it mean to be a human before God? And so
Before
theological
God or before
anthropology
Christ?
before Christ, yeah. But then so Christ, Jesus Christ, from a Christian standpoint, you would say then lived out the human vocation properly. And what it result in? His death, because it's in a world that's not oriented towards living in a human vocation.
Well,
It's in a
unless you're a
world that's
hunter-gatherer
oriented
living
toward,
in the Kalahari at the same time, in which you were behaving in a Christ-like way and getting along just fine.
yeah, yeah.
So,
So,
okay.
so, so then a human vocation then is to be a human, which means there's a calling to bear witness to the goodness of God that's in everything, to treat all of creation as kin, to treat all people in ways that with dignity. And so the human creation is to live into this vision of the kingdom of God that's already breaking into the present in little ways. And these little ways are, for example, I talked about Julian the apostate. It's never good if your name has the apostate after it typically, but so Julian the apostate, I understand where he's coming from considering his family was killed by Constantine. That I understand that he wanted to bring the Greek culture back to the center,
Neoplatonism, yeah,
animating,
effectively.
right, right. And so at one point, though, when plagues broke out, what do you do in that culture? If someone's sick, you get them out, right? You cast them out. And so what happened then was the Christians went out where these folks were. And they prayed for them, they anointed them with oil, they gave them food, and most importantly, they gave them human presence and care. And this, what happened then? Well, some immunity was built up, some people came to health, and then as a result of that, then they came to the Christian faith because they said it's the practice of the faith that drew me to it, not a doctrine. This care did. So Julian the apostate then calls all the priests to him, and he says, "Look, these impious Galileans," which is what he called Christians, impious Galileans, impious because they didn't worship the state sponsored gods. Galileans as a diminutive way of talking about Christians following this dead guy from Galilee. These impious Galileans care not only for their own sick, but for ours as well. That's a way of being in the world that's bearing witness to the way that the world should be. That's hospitality, that's care, that's friendship. Christian practices that give a vision of the kingdom of God. And we try to do that at Renew with our relationship with the horses as well. It's sort of a vision of the peaceable kingdom where humans and animals work together in harmony.
If you were to put this Christian view, and I want to go back to, is anything in the New Testament talking about the right relationship of human to nature? But let's just put that to the side for now. If you were to go to your average suburban megachurch in the South and posit your view on eco-theology, bio biologianism,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
what would they say to you?
So I'm not 100% sure. My suspicion is if I were going in that context, I would have a whole bunch of Bible verses with what I'm saying
Right.
because they would be really anxious about my theological conversation partners. They would
Why do you
say,
think why do you think they wouldn't be like, actually, you know what? Yeah, Ben, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Let's do it. Let's go out plant. We're going to raise $1 million and plant a forest in our backyard right now. Like, why would there be a difficulty taking on your point of view when your point of view is not only seemingly vocational and very Christian, but also common sense? So
because I
where would
think
it be coming from? Their pushback.
Well, I think it's a habitus, right? A habitus that they've been formed into,
Mm,
which is a sort of embodied way of interpreting and seeing in the world that's been informed by a misoriented dominion, the drive
mm,
to differentiate themselves from creatures, and for many of them, understanding this world as a dramatic backdrop. And then along with that, it's it's a almost a kind of Bible worship. I would say that Jesus isn't the
mm.
Lord.
It's interesting.
Their interpretation of the Bible is the Lord. And so I'm calling into question
Mm.
long entrenched biblical interpretations of scriptures that aren't just a matter of opinion, but are a matter of identity.
Yeah, yeah, that's well
And
put.
so it's tough to have this discourse. In order to have genuine discourse, there has to be the openness to the possibility that I'm wrong.
Here's another question. Okay, so let's go to a different abusive colonistic thing outside of America. Let's go to my own family and the British Empire and all of that. What's interesting about the British Empire is that they definitely did all sorts of bad stuff. And at the same time, there was a conservation movement that was similar to like the Roosevelt conservation movement, which people would say cynically came on the back of, Native American genocides and so on. Yes, yes, it did. And the formation of national parks in Africa and that sort of thing were also predicated upon, mass displacements and removals of peoples and so on. Not in every case, you've got the Maasai still in the Masai Mara and that sort of thing, but for the most part, and this idea of primordial nature existing without humanity in a pristine form is bullshit. Humans were always there, but just living in right relationship, not wrong relationship. However, for example, let's say if you were in the British Forest Service in British India in 1933, and you were administering a tract of forest, you would give 1% of that forest land over to people who wanted to log it and the remaining 99% would be regarded as sacrosanct to be, blah, blah, blah. And if I'm here in Germany, and I was just actually riding through the woods today with a very lovely Christian American called Connie Urbach, who works within therapeutic riding and out of Tennessee. And we were just admiring the forest. And we were talking about how this forest is maintained. It is a working forest, it's logged, but it's not clear cut. So it's logged in a very thoughtful way. The timber is absolutely sold. You can see the trees that have been marked up, but they never let the canopy disperse and they never let the root system get troubled. And
Right.
there's all kinds of biodiversity in that forest. So there's, you know, all kinds of wildlife. We were seeing it, as we were riding through. There's all kinds of interesting plant life and blah, 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 blah. And now, the reason I'm saying all of these things is that the area that I'm in Germany is very Christian. Those people that were administering the British Empire would have seen themselves as the three C's: commerce, civilization, and Christianity altogether.
Right.
But it
Right.
seems to be
Right.
a very American thing. This idea that, again, it's where we started the podcast, that the Christian viewpoint means destruction.
Yeah. So it's related to it's related to this idea that we have unlimited resources. We just
But
keep
the people who went to Africa
expanding.
felt they did, and the people in the 17th century in
Yeah.
Germany thought they did.
Well, I mean, it's still happening everywhere. It's related to meat
Fair
to
enough.
some degree, isn't it?
Fair
I
enough.
mean,
Fair enough.
all right, let's look at Brazil. What's it? Brazilian rainforest. What's happening? They're becoming a place for cattle,
Yeah.
right? Why? Because they want the money that comes from selling the meat for cattle. So
Right.
then what kind of things do you have to now grow if you're going to support these cattle? You have to grow the corn that you turn into silage that you feed the cattle. None of that is supporting human growth. None of it's That's happening in the United States as well. I was shocked when I moved to the Midwest how humid it was. I thought I lived in the armpit of America when I lived in the historical triangle of Jamestown, Yorktown, and Williamsburg. I lived in a swamp, no,
It can get pretty sweaty there, yeah.
it can get very sweaty there. And then I thought, oh, that's it. And then I come out to the Midwest and I'm like, gosh, it's just as humid. Where's it coming from? The cornfields, these ridiculous cornfields. I drove my daughter to school on the far end of
Why
Iowa.
do the cornfields make it humid? Other grasslands, because corn is a grass.
Yeah, it's just from the way that it produces the corn. Somehow it's just letting out all kind of humidity. I don't know all the details of it. I don't know if it has to do with the seeding and the chemicals and all that. I just know as I drive across Iowa, I see cornfield, 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 and none of it's for human consumption. It's all for the next state you drive through and see cattle, 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 cattle.
In
And
feedlots. Yeah.
and what's that doing to the environment?
Yeah.
Right? What's that doing to the environment? So I think some of it has to do with just straight up Christianity hasn't provided a strong critique to the way that we've treated the environment based on our dietary commitments. And what's that? Christianity hasn't had a critique to that in the mainstream because we're all just a bunch of meat eaters who want to be able to buy our hamburger for $3.99 a pound at a big box store for convenience. So this is what I'm talking about. It's going to cost. This kind of movement's going to cost, and in the U.S. we're not ready to face that cost yet. And I think that it's in the generations that come behind. The kids that grew up, the kids that are growing up now, it's different. I mean, they see people with disabilities in leading roles on TV, not just used as a prop or as inspiration porn for somebody else, right? They see diversity in terms of sexuality, and they are feeling the impact of guns in schools. So the people who are starting these environmental movements, these movements against assault weapons and these sorts of things, these are the young people. And the young people are the ones who are going to have to say, hey, it's worth the sacrifice to start to make a difference. And the young people who are Christians are going to have to say, our theology is not prepared for this. And
Well,
so we have to revisit it.
yeah, I thought our theology is not prepared for this. So, when I asked you for where's the environmentalism in the Bible, you gave me something from Job, but it's not like it's everywhere in the Bible, right? And where is it in the New Testament? Or is it there?
Yeah, I mean, it's
Or do we have
you
to
have
read
to
between the lines to find it?
you have to read between the lines, but in Romans chapter 8, it's going to talk about all of creation groaning for redemption. And then in Philippians, it's going to talk about Jesus is the sort of the head over all that is. All of creation comes into its fullness in Jesus Christ. And then you're going to get a vision in Revelation of the tree restored. I mean, the mythology of Adam and Eve with rejecting the hospitality of God. It's not about the apple. It's really more about the rejection of the hospitality of God. It's about hubris and these sorts of things. But when we see the restoration vision in Revelation, then we have the tree of life, and we have the river of life. We have those sorts of visions of verdancy and fertility and life. And so it's not strong, but of course the Bible is fundamentally a book to be read outside. I mean, Jesus in the Wilderness, there's some beautiful artwork by Stanley
Mhm.
Spencer called
Jesus in the
Jesus
wilderness.
Jesus in
Okay.
the
Maybe
Wilderness.
that's what we're looking for.
I think we're looking at, so it's not really told what happens there. People think, okay, he goes 40 days and he's fasting, he's starving, he's miserable, he's tempted by the devil. And then where does he go? He gets baptized in water, starts his public ministry, this sort of thing. Stanley Spencer wondered what happened when the person who's involved in creation is there with creation. And he has these clever pictures, having been impacted by the devastation of World War I, the trenches and mustard gas and fire and everything, just the death and destruction. I think his paintings are a kind of refugia. It's a vision of
Who are we talking about
refugia.
here? Sorry?
Stanley Spencer.
Stanley
Who-
Spencer. Oh, yes, yes. Yeah.
Yep. And so I
Oh,
think I can't remember where his art is now, maybe in Durham. but he wanted to do 40 paintings for the 40 days. But one of them is Jesus.
Yes, his paintings are all over churches in England. Yeah, yep, yep,
Yeah,
yep. He smashed that.
he does one called, the foxes have holes, where Jesus seems to be part of the environment and the foxes are playing around him. And there's one where he's holding a scorpion and the scorpion's obviously stung him, but he's looking at it with such curiosity and love. And there's one where, he's like the mother hen with the hens around. And there's one where even the lilies, where he looks like a boulder and he's attending to these lilies. Stanley Spencer was saying, it was this time in the wilderness that gave Jesus the strength to do what he was going to have to do the next 3 years in his public ministry. It was this connection, and maybe perhaps he was nurtured and cared for by the very environment.
If you made it this far into the podcast, then I'm guessing you're somebody that, like me, loves to read books about not just how people have achieved self-actualization, but particularly about the relationship with nature, spirituality, life, the universe, and everything. And I'd like to draw your attention to my books. If you would like to read the story of how we even arrived here, perhaps you'd like to check out the 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Horseboy and The Long Ride Home, and come on an adventure with us and see what engendered, what started Live Free, Ride Free. And before we go back to the podcast, also check out The Healing Land, which tells the story of my years spent in the Kalahari with the Sun, Bushmen, hunter-gatherer people there, and all that they taught me and mentored me in, and all that I learned. Come on that adventure with me. Now, I think you've just drawn my attention to something interesting. So, yes, there was, of course, an environmental, philosophical, mythological movement within Christianity that we all know about but don't pay a lot of attention to because they were written as children's books. And that, of course, is Narnia.
Yeah.
So C.S. Lewis, as we know, goes through World War One and then has a sort of a Christian rebirth. And what does he write? Of course, he writes lots of things. But the Narnia Chronicles are with characters who the church took from pagan religion and mythology and turned into demons and devils, people with horns on their head and goat's legs, for example, and turns them into the good characters because they were, of course, back then. And the White Witch is manipulating that creation, but
Mastery and
Aslan,
control.
who is a lion, who's an animal, and lion should lie down with the lamb, and so on and so on. But nonetheless, and maybe that's it again. Lion shall lie down with the lamb. I think that was what was fundamentally driving C.S. Lewis. That idea comes out of World War One, which is everyone tries to kill everybody, and now let's get back to lion with the lamb, and but specifically going back to pagan imagery and mythology. Silenus is in there, Bacchus is in there, all these pagan deities are in there, and yet there's no and Christ is a lion, and there's no separation in C.S. Lewis's mind about that Christmas. And the other one is Tolkien. So it's Tolkien.
I was going to say Tolkien,
right,
and the trees, the wisdom of the trees.
He goes through World War One, the same thing.
Yep.
And what they both also describe in their when the villains are trying to, whether it's Sauron and Saruman cutting down Fangorn, or the White Witch, turning everything into stone, concrete,
Yeah.
what they were seeing, of course, pre-World War One was industrialization of the countryside. And then they were seeing the absolute devastation of nature. They were in these French forests that just got absolutely destroyed, but then were resurrected later. They're back now. And then they came out of this and they wrote these books, which are deeply Christian books with elves and wizards and fauns and thing as a so I guess it's interesting. I guess it is there hiding in plain sight, this environmental movement within the church.
Yeah.
Um, are are you all gonna bring us back to Mr. Tumnus and and Tom Bombadil?
Yeah, no, I think I'm going to try to do it through nature excursions with children. I think I'm going to do it with a recasting of the horse as having a vocation. Yeah, I think that's the way that I'm imagining moving forward in this conversation, and through my own how I consume and how I, because we have to consume. I mean, everything consumes or you die. You have to consume, but how you
Well, and
consume
consuming
what?
is being part of nature. It's just how we do it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the most, yeah, soil is death and life
Mm,
at the same time. And so how do I engage the world in a faithful way that doesn't that contributes to the flourishing of all creatures and land? And that's a challenge. It's a challenge with where you get your clothes and what you eat, and
mm, it is.
even how you take care of your pond. You know, all
Mm.
those are challenging.
Yeah, what you feed your horse, absolutely. Let
What you
alone what
feed
you
your
feed
horse.
yourself. Okay, I would like to see like forest schools. I would like to see forest churches. Are we going to go back to sacred groves? Can we go back to sacred groves?
So that is Victoria Loors, Loorz. Victoria
Victoria
Loors. She
Laws,
wrote a
Loorz. Yep.
That is right. She wrote a book called Church of the Wild.
Church
And
of the Wild.
Church of the Wild. And she was a minister for years
I
working
love this
inside
book.
the church. And then she realized that all the things we've talked about were a challenge for her. So she started having outdoor church services. And now there's a whole network in the United States of wild churches. There's a wild church network. So
Wild Church Network.
So in just about every, and she even has almost like a wild church, Church of the Wild seminary almost. Like she has
Really?
trainings you can do, and they'll be reading, Thomas Berry and let's see, Harlan Lane, The Great Conversation, and they'll read.
Look, I've just Googled it.
Oh, you
See,
found her. Yeah.
yeah, just found her.
Yeah, so I've had a couple conversations with her. She's doing really creative work on that. Again, it's outside of the mainstream of Christianity, but I think it's starting to have some.
Popping up all over the land like
Yeah.
wild mushrooms after a
Yep.
spring rain. Wild church communities are responding to a call from deep within to
Yep.
change the way we relate to the natural world, moving from a collection of objects to a communion of subjects. Thomas Berry.
There you go. See, there's the conversation.
In
So,
this age of mass extinctions, wow. Okay, it's all there.
mhm.
So why
Yep.
didn't I know about this? I'm throwing a little tantrum now. That's my tantrum. Why? No, I've been living back in Texas for 20 plus years. Why has no one told me about this?
Yeah, I have no idea. I can't tell you that, but I'm
How
glad we're
how
having
how
the
did you find out
conversation.
about it? What was the before and the after of you discovering this nature movement within the church or
Hmm.
or within Christianity? Let's not even say the church. Let's say within Christianity.
Yeah, I think growing up, there were some things around stewardship. There were some Bible study sort of things around stewardship in the 90s, but none of them were really gripping. It wasn't until I think it was related to doing research for this grant. Maybe. No, it was, you know what? It was my relationship with horses. It was through Melissa when I was hanging out with horses. And of course, I'm always thinking theologically. And I thought, who's really written about this? And I couldn't find anything directly about that. But I found the larger conversation, which was theology of animals and biologians and
Okay.
eco-theologians and these sorts of things. So
So like
a
all
lot
of
of it actually comes
everything
out
to our
of
lives, basically. Yeah.
a lot of it. So there's a conversation strand that's connected to process philosophy and theology, which comes out of Alfred North Whitehead's work and Charles Hartshorne's work. It's the idea. It's basically a different way of thinking about how the world's put together. That there that you aren't just a body, but you're a collection of actual entities that are all working together. It's sort of a different structure to the world that had them make some creative theological moves to take creation more seriously so that we are in fact part of creation and not set apart of it, as a lot of the inherited theology spoke. So that was called process theology. And there's some really creative work on embodiment and bodies that comes out of process theology. So that was one area that got me thinking about that. And the other was, of course, disability and disability studies, since people with disabilities are often cast as less than human. It made people in disability studies say we're treated similarly to animals, and then
Mm.
some theology developed around that as well.
Mm.
But it's recent for me.
Were you always Christian? Were you always a believer? Did you reject it at some point? Do you have your punk rock band days? Like what? Just quickly, what's your bio? How did you evolve?
Yeah. I mean, I was the kid whose parents made him go to church when I was young, and I'd sneak out of church and play in the woods behind church and show up at the end of the church with leaves in my hair and dirt on my knees. And they say, "Where were you?" I was like, "Oh, I was at the youth group or whatever." When I had the chance to sort of make more decisions, the Christianity I was experiencing wasn't very compelling to me. And so I thought it's I would just try to do what made me happy, but that became very self-interested and wasn't at least satisfying either. And then I finally met some people who lived out their faith in a way that I felt was authentic.
How old were you at that point?
I was 19. So two things happened at that time. Well, probably three things. So I was studying architecture and realized I didn't like architecture. So I was having a vocational crisis. My dad got cancer and was going to die really soon. So I took a year off to take care of him. He ended up only living another 4 months. He had a massive brain tumor.
Mm.
I wanted to know more about the Bible from somebody I felt like really knew it and wasn't manipulating it. And the person who most fit that was a quadriplegic man who I'd meet with once a week, who would take me through the Bible. And, I'd have to flip him over and I'd have to put a cough drop in his mouth and I'd put the drink up. So, this idea of service, the idea that people with disabilities have things to offer, those things were there at the beginning of my owning my Christianity, I suppose. And then I started volunteering for a youth organization because I thought if someone had told me this when I was a kid in this way, I would have probably been more interested. So I was doing that. And then for the disability part, really, that was with our son. So I was getting ready to go to Princeton Theological Seminary to do a doctorate in basically mission ecumenics history of religion, which that's not worth continuing to talk about, but that was my focus. Right before I went, my son had a seizure, and we found out he had had a stroke at birth and was missing about a third of his brain. So that taught me to teach him differently. And I found that classroom wasn't the best place. This is not unlike your story. Yours
Yeah.
was the best place was have him on the back of a horse. Mine was have him outside bouncing on a trampoline or scooting outside. That he needed that in order to focus. So he listened to Homer while he was bouncing on a trampoline, and I would read things to him while he was moving outside. So outside became really important way for me to connect with my son. We got him into mountain biking. We'd spend a whole lot of time outside. And then that needed to be more integrated with the faith that seemed to be you go to church, you go inside the church, you do spiritual stuff, and then you go out into the world where it doesn't necessarily apply, And so I needed a more integrated faith.
Where did it go with your son? Quickly, what was the trajectory
Yeah,
after?
so the trajectory for me, I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, but he had sensory integration issues, visual tracking issues, visual range issues. So what's that called? Peripheral vision issues.
Right.
A lot of markers of being on the autism spectrum, but never a clear diagnosis because so many different things going on. We homeschooled him because school was a nightmare for him, but he really wanted to go to high school with his friends. So we got him to the point where he could. He barely made it through high school. At the end of it, he got in trouble for some drugs because the drugs he used to self-medicate and sort of figure out who he was because he had social integration sort of challenges as well. That was a big move for him coming through that. Actually, when I picked him out from jail, I said the first thing you're going to hear me say is God loves you no matter what you do or say, and I love you no matter what you do or say, and we're going to get this through this together. And the second thing I said was not as nice. It was he sort of gave me some pushback, and I said I could have left you to be in the jail to be somebody else's bitch, but for the next week you're going to be mine, and you're going to get your hair cut and do exactly what I say. So yeah, I was dealing with the tension myself. But the
Indeed.
good news is he worked hard, had an aptitude for computers, put himself through a computer coding school, and now he's making more money than I am, and living in Grand Rapids, and is just a delightful, he's always been a delightful, wonderful kid. But now we relate on a different level as he's an adult who
Did he ever
his decision.
regrow that part of his brain that had been lost, or
No, he's made other connections.
right, the brain just made up for it?
Yeah, he's
Wow.
he's always been, I'd say he's my other kids wouldn't mind me saying that Tommy's the smartest of my kids. I think he's smarter than me as well in terms of he just has a remarkable intellect. He just schooling doesn't know what to do with someone
Yeah,
who
sure.
who learns in nonlinear
Well, but also what you did, of
way.
course, was you created all that neuroplasticity by getting him out in nature, moving,
Yeah.
BDNF, Purkinje cells, all of that stuff, which
Yeah, exactly. And in the process, I learned about universal design and learning without knowing there
mm,
was such a thing.
got it.
So when
So
I found
he
this,
was really your theological teacher.
oh, absolutely. He was my
Ah,
teacher for theological education. So if you take a course with me at the seminary, it's going to be
mm,
nothing like a typical academic course.
how
Um,
very interesting.
yeah. So, for example, in a youth ministry class, I'm going to have you learn about adolescence from social scientists and then create artwork that expresses the feeling of being an adolescent. I'm going to have you come into class and I'm going to put out games and I'm going to have you start playing the games and you're not going to know why. And then after half an hour, I'm going to tell you to switch games with someone else. And then you're going to have to play that game. And then I'm going to cut you off after 10 minutes. And I'm going to say, okay, let's talk about this. Who were the leaders? Who was uncomfortable with this kind of exercise? Who thought at the beginning, hey, this is a learning exercise. What are we trying to learn? Who just enjoyed it? Who was competitive? Who was collaborative? So I wanted them to learn about their own learning styles so they can destigmatize other learning styles and relativize their own learning styles. And so universal design and learning for me made a whole lot of sense. And it's informed the way that I teach, it informs the way we run our center. So we're going to have a symposium on disability in ministry the second Saturday in July. All this stuff ministry website. We'll have a symposium, and the first half hour of it is an example of universal design and learning and worship that's led by people with disabilities.
We're gonna have to do a second podcast. Okay. So, okay.
We haven't even gotten into the bodybuilding.
I know I'm trying to marshal my questions here. We're approaching the 2 hour mark, and we're definitely going to have to. All right, listeners, I promise you, we're going to get Ben back. In fact, maybe we'll get Ben and Melissa back together as well, because Melissa, his wife, who runs Renew Therapeutic Riding in Holland, Michigan, is on. I've just done a fascinating interview with her over on Equine Assisted World. But I think we need both of you guys on to continue this conversation here. All right, so here's another quick question because we're approaching the 2 hour mark, and you know, I think we've blown everybody's brains. So let's give a bit of a pause and then we'll come back and we'll pick this conversation up in a few weeks. But with your permission, why Christianity then? Because we've got plenty of other very good spiritual ways of looking at the world. We've got Buddhism, it's a good one. We've got mystic traditions within Islam. We've got mystic traditions within Judaism. We've got, lots of good stuff. Shamanism and so on and so on, all of which was existing before Christianity. And so that's number one. Why then put a label on it? Why Christianity? And then the second question is, because I could perhaps anticipate the answer of why Christianity might be to say, but Rupert, it's because it's a religion predicated upon compassion, although of course Buddhism is too, but hey. But Christianity does not practice compassion in its mainstream.
Right.
So, and why not? So, okay, so why Christianity? And then why is the Christ message the one message within Christianity that's ignored?
Oh, sure. That's all fair. That's all fair. So, on the one hand, it has to do with who you interact with in terms of how you receive the Christ message.
Oh, no,
So,
no, no.
I spend most of my day with a lot of people who I believe are living
Indeed,
faithfully.
indeed. But you know what I'm saying.
Absolutely, I know what you're saying. I accept the critique with open arms.
More a question.
Yeah,
Christian. Yeah,
but
yeah.
why Christianity? So I would say fundamentally, then I'm responding to the call of Follow Me by Jesus, who I believe is still alive. I don't think he's hanging up in heaven watching cops waiting to come back again when the world's destroyed. I believe that Jesus is actively working in the world. Now, there's obviously, then why is there still suffering? Why is all this? Because we live in a created world with contingencies. A log can be used to build a house, or it can fall on your head and kill you. Water can be drunk to nourish you, or it can drown you, right? And so we have choice and opportunities in that. But I'm compelled
But the world
by,
is older than Christianity, right? And we've had
oh, absolutely.
Christ-like figures, whether it's the Buddha or Zoroaster or ones we've forgotten, you know.
Right. So it has to be a personal response then, right? And
Yeah,
so
it's just a heart feeling.
yeah, it's a personal response
Oh, that's good enough for me.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
fine.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so but my Christianity doesn't take me out of dialogue with other religions. My Christianity it's really Christianity is such a compromised word, especially in the United States, where it means, you're a Republican who voted for Trump, who doesn't seem to, and again, this is political, anybody who's listening, but the legislation that's coming out doesn't seem to care for the most marginalized people who I imagine Jesus would be spending most of the time with, as he would be pushing against empire. And so
You
that's the
wouldn't be
Christian.
telling people to go out and buy automatic rifles at Walmart. Yeah, no.
I imagine not. So then that's the Christ that I follow.
Mm.
Christianity as a religion has its problems. And since I'm one who follows Christ and have been in the US within a certain tradition, then I speak out of that tradition even as I critique it as one within the tradition.
Okay, okay, okay. And okay, why is the Christ message the one message within Christianity in America that is marginalized? The actual Christ message is marginalized within Christianity. Why?
I think because Christianity in large part is too enamored with power
It just
and that.
yeah, it just became another power thing. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
fair enough.
Yeah, it's too costly. It's too costly to follow Christ. It's too costly to
Yeah,
do
it's
as
a pain in the
Jesus
ass.
taught
It
us
is.
to.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Interestingly, as we were talking, Ileana, my wife, my boss, came in and slipped me this little bit of paper. The new Pope is.
Oh, yeah. I saw we had that white smoke. I didn't know who it is.
Yeah, yes, it's the
Yeah.
American dude.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. First, is that the first American Pope? I think it is, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Interesting. Know anything about him?
Not at all.
No, nor do I.
Not at all. I really appreciate the last pope. I think he
Yeah,
was
yeah.
doing some
I think he did an all
important
right
things. Of
job.
course, he was a controversial pope
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I think he was trying to do the very things that Jesus would call him to do. But
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. All right. So we can agree that if you want to live in Christ, it might be a good idea not to cut that forest down and pave the entire planet. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Ben. Can we delve deeper? I've got more questions, and I think, and actually, listeners, especially American listeners, please send us your questions. Put them in the comments below. Even if you hated this, like tell us why. Don't just go, no, it sucked. But just, engage us, engage the dialogue. But come up with a bunch of questions because Ben's a rare breed and he's turned us on to some other rare breeds. And we're going to continue this conversation. So please give us your questions. Ben, how do people find you and how do people find your books?
Well, if you go to the Center for Disability and Ministry, if you just type in Center for Disability and Ministry, I don't believe there's another one.
Center
So,
spelt in the American way, ER,
yes,
the
in the
wrong way.
American
Center
one.
for Disability
And Ministry.
and Ministry.
And it's if you have a hard time finding it, you can find it on the Western Theological Seminary website. That's where I work. Western
Western
Theological.
Theological Seminary.
Yep.
In
And all my contact information is right there on the center
so
website, as
so
well
people
as a
can send
link
you
to
an
our
email. They
podcast.
could.
Yep, they can contact me that way.
Okay. And books, publications, what should people look at if they want to know about your work?
So that'll be on my faculty website as well. But 3 books published at this point. One called Practicing Witness, which is the very thing we were talking about. That it's less about what you say, about your Christian practice in the world. The second book is called Amplifying Our Witness. That's about youth ministry and disability. So it's right now, it's the only book on youth ministry and disability at this point.
Wow.
And then Disabling Mission Enabling Witness puts mission studies in conversation with disability studies to see what comes out the other side. 2 books I'm working on right now. I also edit a book series that's co-branded between my center and InterVarsity Press Academic. So I have a book I'm doing with John Swinton of Aberdeen called Missing Voices in Theology, where we engage people who use augmented speech or who
Ah,
have lost their sort of platform because of an onset disability or a diagnosis. And we are setting up sort of why does this happen? And then we're putting their voices in there.
John Swinton, University of Aberdeen.
Yep, brilliant guy. And then I'm doing a book with Melissa, Harmony with Horses, a theology of equine assisted services. And I'm building on the work of like the Dorances and what's your name? You're right there. Ray Hunt. How do
Yeah,
you forget the name Ray Hunt? I don't know.
yeah.
But that whole revolution in horsemanship and the way they were talking about harmony, how do we jive that with Christian theology? And how does that inform the way you run a center? And then I have a project I'm doing on bodybuilding and theology.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to that one yet. Yeah, when you meet Ben, he's a big dude. It's there's a whole other conversation there, which is interesting to me because most people use bodybuilding around narcissism, and so it's very interesting to meet someone who's into it, who's coming it from a whole other point of view. But I think I'm just going to leave that as a look for you listeners for the next conversation. Okay, this has been really educational for me, so I appreciate it, Ben. Will you come on again in a few weeks and we can talk more?
Absolutely. I'd love to come on with Melissa. That would be a lot of
Yeah,
fun.
let's do it. Let's do it.
Thank you.
And then we'll try to get some of these others on Victoria Laws and
The
Mr.
Reenstras. Yeah, Ron and Deb Reenstra would be a great, because he's also involved with an organization called Arocha, Arocha. You can look up that online, but that's a eco theology sort of a organization as well.
Okay, okay, okay. And I think I know lots of people within our sort of horseboy world who are Christians who are also looking for something with this. I guess actually I should be paying homage. So actually I want to dedicate this. I want to dedicate this episode to my cousin Frank Taylor. My cousin Frank Taylor died a few years ago. He was the man who really pioneered the whole concept of agroforestry, dryland agroforestry. If you've ever picked up a devil's claw product for arthritis, he was the guy that pioneered devil's claw as a viable commercial product out of the deserts of Botswana. He worked for many, many years with marginalized hunter-gatherer communities who've been displaced by more aggressive cattle owning cultures and basically enslaved by them. And he helped them to plant wild gardens of their wild plants that they had, San Bushmen, where they'd always gathered these things medicinally. And he helped them to find the most drought-resistant phenotypes and then market those. And he had a whole, and he broke that international market open. He died from a scorpion sting, aged about
Wow.
almost 90, about 3 or 4 years ago. Inspiration. Very Christian man, even though he was hanging out very much in that shamanic world. And I remember when I first met him as a young adult, I was 18, 19, and I had just hitchhiked across Zimbabwe and Botswana, and he picked me up. And he said to me, his first question when I got in the truck with him was, "So tell me, Rupert, where are you in your spiritual odyssey?" And I didn't know what to tell him. And then I said, "Well, actually, I had a dream not so long ago that I met the devil, and the devil was playing the violin. And when I heard this music, I felt this great sense of sadness that I was losing something. But I can't explain the dream. What do you think?" And he said, "Oh, yes, well, the devil hates to losing a teammate. So, you can expect some resistance, yeah, if you're looking at other directions." And he really mentored me through a lot of my early work with the San Bushmen and that human rights work that I did. And I always marveled at the fact that he could have this really sort of evangelical faith without in any way trying to convert the people that he worked with or for, really. And he lived his life totally in service to nature in this interesting way. So yeah, I think I'd like to dedicate this episode to Frank Taylor from Felt Products Research and Development in Botswana, who,
Well,
yeah.
that's
So
beautiful.
I guess there have been threads here that I just haven't seen.
Mhm. Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. That means a lot.
It
And
was an
thanks for
effort.
having me on. It's always a fun to speak to you. I want to hear you talking more next time we have a conversation though. So
People have interviewed me, yeah, that's all out there. But I mean, I'm
not with my questions though, right? It's all about the questions, right?
okay, well that's fine. We'll trade questions then. What we'll do on the next one is you write down your questions, I'll write down mine, and we'll have a question off
Sounds good.
with Melissa as the
Moderator.
well, as the one who'll actually come out with the truth, probably.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, I'm honored. Thank you so much, Ben, for coming on. I'll see you in a few weeks with Melissa.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
All right, my friend. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. If you did, please help us to make more. Please like, subscribe, tell a friend, give us a thumbs up. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, please go to my website, rupertisaacson.com. And if you'd like to find out about our certification courses with autism, education, horsemanship, everyday shamanism, there's a whole range of cool stuff. Putting a show together like this is not an easy task. If you'd like to support us, please consider going to our Patreon page and showing us some love there. Even the smallest donation, it really helps us to keep the good content coming. So go to rupertisaacson.com and click on the Patreon link. Not to mention our excellent merch. Please go to our shop and check out some of our really cool rock and roll themed merch, t-shirts, hoodies, all that sort of thing. rupertisaacson.com, it's all there. I can't wait for our next guest and also to meet you there. In the meantime, remember, live free, ride free.